Number 8. Gana Zuzina. In 2006, British millionaire Barry Pring fell in love with a young Ukrainian stripper named Gana Zuzina. To get her to leave her job, he supported her financially, and a year later the couple married. In 2008, the couple celebrated their one-year anniversary over dinner. Zuzina claimed she'd left her gloves in the restaurant and rushed back inside, leaving Pring staggering and seemingly intoxicated in the street, waiting for their taxi. Out of nowhere, a stolen car with fake license plates and no headlights mowed the businessman down and killed him. Within days of her husband's death, Zuzina flew back to Britain, where she attempted to move into Pring's home and claim his assets. And when Pring's body was returned to the UK, his liver and kidneys were missing, and he'd been embalmed, making it impossible for experts to test his blood for poison. Pring's family strongly suspected Zuzina had something to do with his death and spent copious amounts of money in order to get justice. A private investigator found that a restaurant employee had offered to call a taxi for the couple the night Pring was run over, but Zuzina had declined. During dinner, Pring had complained of a burning sensation in his chest, suggesting in hindsight that perhaps he was poisoned. But with the organs missing from his corpse and an inability to test his blood, there was no way to know for sure. A judge ruled that Pring had been unlawfully killed after he was tricked into standing in the street. But Zuzina won a bid to overturn the findings, and a new inquest was granted. Pring's family eventually dropped their case against her, and she received a six-figure payout from her late husband's $2 million estate. Number 7. Double Trouble. In 2014, when wealthy 84-year-old Manhattanite Paul Aronson found himself wanting the companionship of a younger woman, he turned to a website that matches sugar daddies with sugar babies. It was on this site he connected with 17-year-old Shayna Foster. She agreed to meet the retired lawyer for dinner and asked if she could bring along her twin sister, Shalane. Aronson readily agreed, but what he probably thought would be twice the fun turned out to be a double dose of terror. After enjoying an expensive meal, the twins joined the octogenarian at his luxury townhouse for drinks, and unbeknownst to Aronson, to rob the old man as well. Armed with zip ties, the sisters bound their victim to his coffee table, cleaned his wallet of nearly $500 in cash, and left him helpless on his living room floor while they went on a shopping spree with Aronson's credit cards. A neighbor rescued Aronson 20 hours later, and law enforcement caught up with Shayna and Shalane, who claimed that the old man had made them uncomfortable and asked them to do things they didn't want to do. Shayna, who took the heat for the crimes and admitted she was the mastermind, described Aronson as old, ugly, and disgusting, and even went as far as saying he deserved what happened. She received a prison sentence of 5 years, while Shalane was sentenced to 1 1/3 to 4 years for her lesser role in the disturbing attack. Number 6. Sandrine Devillard. Nicknamed the Hermit of the Alps, Marcel Amfo spent much of his life in a wooden cabin with no electricity or running water, near the French village of Paix-Saint-Pierre. His simple lifestyle allowed him to save a fortune. He bought a sizable portion of valuable land that only increased in value as the area's reputation as a winter wonderland grew among tourists. The eccentric millionaire built several chalets on his property, where he allowed his friends and family to live rent-free. One day in 2010, a glamorous real estate agent from Paris named Sandrine Devillard knocked on Amfo's door and offered to buy his land. He refused, but agreed to go out to dinner with Devillard. Amfo quickly fell in love with the younger woman, and they married a year later. Believing that Devillard was only with the man for material gain, many of Amfo's friends and loved ones vocally opposed the union. Their suspicion only grew after the wedding, as the couple continued to live apart from one another, with Devillard remaining in Paris and Amfo staying in his shack. Just a year after marrying the couple, and 2 of Devillard's friends were in a car crash that killed Amfo. Everyone else survived, giving rise to rumors that Devillard had something to do with her husband's death. And soon enough, she told the people living on his property that as Amfo's sole heir, she planned to evict them and develop the land. But Devillard's plans came to a screeching halt when she learned that shortly before his death, Amfo had reversed his will, leaving everything, including ownership of the houses he had built, to his family and friends. Devillard argued that the signature on the will looked forged, but the court was unconvinced and upheld the man's decision to leave her empty-handed. So what would you do if you knew a gold digger was taking advantage of your friend? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're liking this video, then please be sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. Mackenzie LUECK. Not everyone who seeks a sugar daddy has their sights set on a luxurious life. Some, like 23-year-old Mackenzie LUECK, are college students who want to focus on their education without having to worry about money. By all appearances, Mackenzie was your typical university athlete from an average American family. Little did her loved ones know she was an experienced sugar baby who relied on wealthy older men for financial support. Mackenzie was so well versed at this lifestyle, she even offered advice and guidance to other aspiring sugar babies on social media. After visiting her family in June of 2019, the 23-year-old arrived at the Salt Lake City airport at around 2:00 a.m. and summoned a cab to a park where she had plans to meet a man. And then Mackenzie was never seen alive again. An extensive investigation led police to 31-year-old Iola Ajayi, an IT specialist the young woman had met through a sugar dating website shortly before her death. Her burned and bound remains and several of her belongings were found in his backyard. Ajayi was arrested for kidnapping, aggravated murder, and desecrating her corpse. At a loss to identify any particular motive, prosecutors argued that the suspect killed just to know what it felt like. Regardless of his reasons for murdering Mackenzie, Ajayi pled guilty to several charges and received a life sentence for his crimes. He even apologized to his victim's family, who remained adamantly unforgiving. Number 4. Roxana Bibi. In September 2016, 65-year-old pensioner Mohammed Youssef was murdered by a couple who wanted to benefit from his life insurance. As he lay sleeping in his Lancashire, England home, 45-year-old Mohammed Arif and his lover, 38-year-old Roxana Bibi, administered a dozen blows to the man's head and slit his throat. Youssef had married Bibi just months before his death, and during that short time, she drained his bank account to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, she was having a secret affair with Arif, and it was during that time that the clandestine couple took out a fraudulent several $100,000 life insurance policy on Youssef at Bibi's urging. Shortly thereafter, Youssef drew up a will leaving everything to his wife. Less than 2 days after returning from a trip to Pakistan, he was dead. At the time, Bibi was in Ireland, but surveillance footage found Arif's car driving past Youssef's home 3 times over the course of 6 hours on the night he was murdered. The victim's landlord discovered his body several days later, and police launched a murder investigation. DNA, cell phone evidence, traffic footage, and financial records quickly led them to Arif and Bibi, who apparently co-conspired to rob Youssef of his assets and then profit from his murder. The pair asserted their innocence but were found guilty of murder. Bibi received a 28-year prison sentence and Arif was sentenced to 32 years behind bars. A third person who provided a false alibi for Arif was handed a 15-month sentence. Following the verdicts, Deputy Chief Inspector Joanne McCoe described Youssef as a gentle and giving community member who fell prey to deadly greed and called his death a cold-blooded assassination of a wholly innocent man. Number 3. Des Campbell. Society tends to automatically think of gold diggers as women. But the next example on today's list shows that men are sometimes just as guilty of forging love while dipping their hands into their unexpecting partner's pocketbook. Des Campbell's intentions were nothing short of sinister when he married his wife Janet in secret in 2004. Unbeknownst to Janet, the New South Wales, Australia man had an established habit of living beyond his means and faced mounting debts. Just a week after the wedding, Janet bought an upscale home for the couple and changed her will, leaving almost half her estate to her new husband. Over the following months, Campbell had 3 affairs and grew increasingly interested in eliminating his wife from the equation while somehow still enjoying the money she had inherited from her first husband. Meanwhile, he denied that he and Janet were in a relationship, period, and described her as pig ugly behind her back. Campbell insisted on taking Janet camping in early 2005, despite her lack of experience with it. He set up their tent just a few feet away from a 164-foot cliff at Royal National Park south of Sydney. Not long after that, Campbell showed up at a police station claiming that Janet had disappeared during a trip to the bathroom, and that he had discovered her dead body at the base of the cliff. Just a week later, he requested access to her will and took one of his girlfriends on vacation. He was absent from his wife's funeral and proposed to his girlfriend just days later. Police accused Campbell of pushing Janet to her death and arrested him for murder. A jury found him guilty, but he maintained his innocence and filed an appeal. The case went to Australia's highest court, which upheld Campbell's conviction. Number 2. Shira Wright. Lorenzen Wright was a professional basketball player with a promising future when he seemingly vanished into thin air during the summer of 2010. While visiting a friend in his hometown of Memphis in July of that year, the NBA star received a call from his ex-wife Shira Wright, who demanded that Lorenzen return their son to her right away. Hours later, a 911 dispatcher received a call from a distressed male with gunshots in the background, but the police did not investigate. Lorenzen's mother, Marion, reported him missing. In the meantime, she grew suspicious of Shira, who casually claimed that her ex-husband was spending time with other women. At the same time, Shira told investigators that Lorenzen had criminal connections and that she last saw him with a man who was trying to sell drugs. She also claimed that men in trench coats had appeared at her doorstep looking for Lorenzen. His remains, riddled with gunshot wounds, were found on an isolated road in a wooded area. The homicide investigation soon went cold. And for the next 7 years, the circumstances surrounding Lorenzen's death remained a mystery. Suspicions about Shira's possible involvement grew as she squandered a $1 million life insurance payout that was meant for the couple's 6 children. Finally, in 2017, police announced that they had found the murder weapon after someone began talking about their involvement in planning Lorenzen's death. Investigators started monitoring Shira's correspondence and found incriminating information, leading to her arrest later that year for murder. She pled guilty for her role in the crime and received a 30-year sentence. But by then, Shira had already served over 500 days in jail and faced as little as 7 more years. She could see freedom as early as 2026. And instead of harboring bitterness towards Shira, Lorenzen's mother thanked her for giving her 6 grandchildren and expressed her intention to focus solely on them. Number 1. Brandee Curry. In May 2017, a 29-year-old Lincoln, Nebraska woman named Brandee Curry and a wealthy 50-year-old man connected through a sugar dating website. Shortly after the pair began dating, the man sold some land that he inherited from his father for $355,000. Curry started hitting him up regularly for cash, using wildly spun tales to persuade him into ponying up. First, she told him that she needed $30,000 to repay some of her recently deceased father's gambling debts after receiving a threat from his bookie, who allegedly threatened to force Curry to work if she didn't come up with the cash. Then she said she needed $14,000 for medical care for her child, who might have cancer, and she later requested $25,000 to buy her friend's photography business with. Investigators determined that Curry's stories were bogus. Her father was still alive and well, and had no gambling debts, and there was no evidence of Curry starting a business. Over a 4-month period, the deceived boyfriend had given her over $97,000 for things detectives could not verify that she actually used any of the money for. Curry was charged with theft by deception of over $5,000, a felony which carried a prison sentence of up to 20 years. And while details about where the case went are scarce, it appears as though she was arrested earlier this year for possession of drug paraphernalia. It probably seemed easy to get away with and perhaps almost non-criminal to dupe her boyfriend into giving her money. But Curry's ill-gotten funds landed her in hot water, serving as a reminder that using someone for material gain can come with some surprisingly harsh consequences. Nobody knows how many women Ted Bundy actually abused and killed, but it's believed that he was responsible for far more than the 30 murders he confessed to. It's hard to imagine why or how a woman would become enamored with such a sick individual, but he received hundreds of letters from smitten females during his time in prison. One writer, a bizarre woman named Janet, was so obsessed with this evil serial killer that even Ted Bundy himself found her letters disturbing. She began writing him in 1979, and he made the mistake of replying to her correspondence once, after which she wrote back stating that she kissed the letter she received from him and held it close to her body. Janet added that she was crying as she responded and professed her undying love for Bundy. Her letters continued pouring in, often containing photographs and begging Bundy to send some back. Fully aware that he was married, she indicated that she was willing to overlook his relationship with his wife and that she'd give anything for an hour alone with him. As if that weren't already creepy enough, Janet began attending Bundy's trials. He found her presence unnerving enough to write a letter to his wife, asking her not to let Janet sit near her at court hearings. He likened the way Janet looked at him to a deranged seagull steadying a clam. Considering Bundy's love of attention and being in the spotlight, Janet must have gone pretty far to push him away. Number 8. School Shooters Fan Club. In early 2018, a teenager named Nicholas Cruz entered Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, and opened fire on its students and staff, killing 17 people and injuring 17 more in the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history. While awaiting trial for his horrifying crimes, the Broward County Jail was inundated with love letters, racy photos, and commissary donations from teenage girls, older women, and men who, for whatever reason, found themselves infatuated with the mass murderer. Cruz had so many admirers, they formed a Facebook group dedicated to gushing over him and brainstorming ways to help his case. Sadly, a lot of the love Cruz received came from teenage girls who, had they been at the crime scene that day, could have very well become one of his victims. Even the killer's public defendant, Howard Finkelstein, who had been a practicing attorney for over 40 years, was astounded by the sheer volume of letters Cruz had received. Thankfully, because the inmate was on suicide watch and because Finkelstein did not want his client to feel elevated for his heinous crimes, all of his incoming correspondence was withheld. Number 7. Dahmer's donors. Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer murdered, dismembered, and cannibalized at least 17 men and boys in and around Milwaukee, Wisconsin between 1978 and 1991. He was finally caught when one of his victims escaped, and when police searched his apartment, they found 4 severed heads, 7 skulls, preserved body parts, and a refrigerator and freezer full of human flesh and organs. While serving several life sentences in prison, Dahmer received letters and gifts from women around the world, coming from as far away as France and South Africa. All in all, the monetary donations totaled over $12,000 and included a $5,920 payment from a woman in London. Meanwhile, the families of Dahmer's victims, who were owed a cumulative $80 million, received none of his benefactor's gifts. Instead, the perverted predator bought cigarettes, audio tapes, comic books, and other luxuries that made his life behind bars more bearable. But his lavish indulgences would not last, and when prison officials found out about the judgments against him, they restricted Dahmer's spending. So why do you think women would send him money knowing everything he did? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, then please be sure to hit that thumbs up and the subscribe button too. Number 6. Devoted to a white supremacist. In 2011, white supremacist Anders Breivik massacred 77 people with pipe bombs and an assault rifle, committing Norway's worst peacetime killing since World War II. He's currently serving a 21-year sentence, and as of 2015, he was receiving as many as 800 letters a year from female admirers professing their undying love for him and begging him to marry them. This outpouring of support for one of the most violent offenders in the country's history shows that the sexual attraction to criminals, known as hybristophilia, is a very real phenomenon. Some of the women who wrote to Anders sympathized with his placement in solitary confinement, describing the object of their affection as vulnerable and saying they felt tortured knowing he was so isolated. Others sent him gifts to cheer him up, seemingly unaware that he was exactly where a mass murderer belongs. At one point, there were fan clubs dedicated to helping Anders' devotees craft the perfect letter for him. A comprehensive guide provided by one club stated that women needed to show their love for militant nationalists. Several years ago, the local interviewed a Swedish woman in her 20s who had written to Anders at least 150 times. She had only received 2 responses, partly because prison officials blocked much of his outgoing mail, and all of her requests to visit Anders had been denied. But the woman remained undeterred, telling the press that she wouldn't want to live without him. Number 5. Ian Brady's Mourners. Between 1963 and 1965, British couple Ian Brady and Myra Hindley murdered 5 young victims and sexually assaulted 4. Both received life sentences for their appalling crimes. When Brady died in prison from cancer at age 79 in 2017, a group of grief-stricken women took to the internet, posting about how devastated they were. One obsessed fan described the murderer as an interesting individual with interesting, fascinating brains and thoughts. Another said that finding out about his death was the worst day ever and said that she was crying all day. And perhaps the most disturbing and extreme example of someone's devotion to Brady, one woman posted a photo of his name she had gotten tattooed on her arm. As it turned out, many members of the bizarre community of people out there who are inspired by and attracted to serial killers had written to Brady over the years, and in many cases, he had responded. Survivors of Brady's victims were more than happy to learn of his death, and experts warned the public that idolizing killers can be extremely harmful to the people whose loved ones he had killed. According to the UK's National Victims Association, by learning that a murderer has fans, families affected by their crimes are forced to relive the trauma they'd fought so hard to work past. All things considered, an attraction to a serial killer is probably best kept to oneself. Number 4. Fritzl's Fangirls. For 24 years, Joseph Fritzl kept his daughter Elizabeth locked in the cellar of his home in the Austrian town of Amstetten. where she birthed 7 of his children and endured prolonged solitude, darkness, malnourishment, and abuse. The entire time, nobody knew what happened to Elizabeth, including Fritzl's wife, Rosemary, who believed their daughter had run away from home. Meanwhile, she had no idea that she was helping Fritzl raise her own grandchildren, whom he somehow convincingly passed off as unwanted or abandoned kids that had more or less appeared on the couple's doorstep. Elizabeth finally escaped from her father's soundproof dungeon when one of their children became critically ill and landed in the hospital. When law enforcement caught up with and arrested Fritzl, hundreds of women sent him love letters, and they were fully aware of his indescribable cruelty. Some tried to see the good in him, even though there clearly was none, with one admirer writing that she believed he only kept Elizabeth captive and sexually abused her to keep her out of trouble. Fritzl's cellmate watched as dozens of disturbing letters poured in, including one that contained a photo of a woman acting out a sexual fantasy with a masked man. As of June 2008, the 73-year-old had received at least 5,000 letters from sympathizers, saw him as a misunderstood old man rather than for the incestuous monster that he really is. Number 3. A wife killer's pen pals. Most people would agree that we often overlook someone's bad behavior because we believe that deep down they're a good person, but that some acts are inexcusable. Yet some people cling to the unrealistic belief that an obviously evil person has a conscience. And this was certainly the case after cheating husband Christopher Lee Watts murdered his pregnant wife Shannon and their 2 daughters in Frederick, Colorado in 2018. Watts pled guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder and confessed to smothering his daughters to death and strangling Shannon in a fit of rage after she had asked to separate. Despite the heinous nature of his crimes, Watts was at no shortage for attention and received at least 17 letters within 9 days of killing his family. Some of the correspondence consisted of hate mails and media requests, while other letters expressed romantic feelings or a desire to be pen pals. One writer, a woman who was also serving time for high-profile financial crimes, told Watts that she felt connected to him. As a seasoned veteran of the criminal justice system, she advised him on how to handle his interactions with the media. The woman then went on to describe her appearance and her past life before becoming a felon. Another fan who found herself attracted to Watts for reasons even she couldn't figure out told him that she knew that he was a good guy, and the compliments didn't end there, with yet another admirer saying that Watts had one of the kindest faces she had ever seen, and another woman sending him a photo of herself in a bikini. But as the 2-timing murderer proved through his own actions, no amount of love will ever be enough. Number 2. A shooter's sympathizers. On July 20th, 2012, James Holmes opened fire on a crowded theater in Aurora, Colorado, killing 12 people and injuring 70 more. He was a man on a mission who had meticulously planned out the massacre and used several automatic weapons to carry out his shocking crimes. In hindsight, all the signs were there that the mass murderer had profound mental issues that had long gone unaddressed. The fact that Holmes was out of his mind, on top of being evil, should have been enough to deter anyone from wanting anything to do with him. But after he landed himself in lockup, the Arapahoe County Jail was flooded with fan mail from women eager to express their fascination with him. During his trial alone, Holmes received over 4,000 letters, cards, and other items in the mail. Many of the pieces included money or sexy photos, which he posted on his cell wall, while others were saturated in perfume or signed in lipstick. One woman who sympathized with what Holmes was going through, in her words, even included pictures of herself and her children. Another admirer wrote that she had purchased plane tickets to attend his upcoming court proceedings, and Holmes even received a letter from a church congregation who referred to him as family and said that they were praying for his health, safety, and well-being. Women doted on the mentally unstable mass murderer, with one describing him as handsome and stating that she liked his strong hands and his facial hair. Many of the letters contained closing lines to the effect of, "Let me know if there's anything I can do for you," implying that the writers were willing to do whatever Holmes asked of them. It's probably a good thing he didn't meet any of them before he committed his unspeakable acts. Number 1. Copycatting a killer. Known as the Hillside Strangler, Kenneth Bianchi sexually assaulted and murdered at least 12 women between 1977 and 1979. He and his cousin Angelo Buono Jr. rode around Los Angeles posing as undercover officers and luring in victims aged anywhere from 12 to 28 years old. Once their targets took the bait and got inside the car, the pair took her back to Buono's house, where they tortured, sexually assaulted, and killed them. Thankfully, police eventually caught up with the duo, who both received life sentences. In 1980, Bianchi began a relationship with Veronica Compton. a woman who had tried to redirect the trial in his favor by testifying for the defense with vague and seemingly contradictory details about his crimes. Compton must have been aware of Bianacci's guilt, however, because she wrote a play based on his crimes titled The Mutilated Cutter and sent it to him in prison, along with some suggestive photos. But the enamored admirer didn't stop there. The same year she and Bianacci connected through letters, Compton decided to try convincing police that the alleged real killer of his victims was still at large by committing a murder in the same fashion he was known for. Bianacci gave Compton a sample of his semen, which she smuggled out of the prison in a rubber glove. Her plan was to plant it on her victim to make it look as if Bianacci had been misidentified through DNA tests. Compton lured her target to a motel room and tried to strangle her, but the victim escaped, and Compton ended up behind bars just like her lover. In a bizarre plot twist, she too ended up finding love in prison and not within its walls. Political science professor James Wallace began corresponding with Compton after he gave a lecture at her prison. He eventually left his wife of 37 years, and the pair got married in a jailhouse ceremony. Wallace even adopted Compton's son and fathered her second child, who was born while Compton was still in prison. Compton was paroled in 1996, but then she was locked back up just 2 weeks later when a social worker paid a visit, and she answered the door naked and with pornographic imagery strewn throughout her home. She was paroled again in 2003 and has since managed to maintain a low profile. Rosemary Letts was 15 years old when she met 27-year-old Fred West in 1969. Her parents opposed the relationship due to the massive age gap. But Rosemary moved into her older lover's Gloucestershire, England home, and the rest was history. When Fred was imprisoned for theft the following year, Rosemary found herself caring for their newborn and for Fred's 2 older children by another woman. Shortly before Fred's release in 1971, Rosemary murdered one of her stepdaughters, Charmaine. She told police that the young girl had gone to live with her biological mother. But Fred had already killed her biological mother, his first wife, and the pregnant mistress. This marked the beginning of a decades-long spree of unspeakable murders and sexual assaults, including against random victims and their own children. After Fred sexually abused his daughter Louise in 1992, the little girl reached out for help, sparking a police investigation. The kids were placed into foster care after they told social workers of the horrific abuse, including threats to kill and bury them beneath the patio, where their sister Heather had ended up. The couple told investors that Heather left voluntarily and that they had no idea where she was. But several children refused to testify, and they were acquitted of all charges. Detectives remained on the case, and when they announced plans to search the West Yard for Heather's remains, Fred confessed to her murder. Heather's remains bore signs of excruciating torture, including having her fingernails ripped off. Too cowardice to face the accountability for his actions, Fred committed suicide in prison while awaiting trial. Rose was found guilty on 10 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Some believe that the deranged couple killed as many as 60 people over their decades-long spree of perversion. Number 8. Gerald Gallego and Charlene Williams. Between 1978 and 1980, a married couple named Gerald and Charlene Gallego terrorized residents around Sacramento, California. They murdered at least 10 victims, who were mostly teenagers that the sadistic pair kept as sex slaves. Born to a sex worker and a career criminal, Gerald had a rough start to his life. He began sexually abusing others when he was just 13 years old, and ended up being married 7 different times. Charlene, on the other hand, came from a respectable background and a supportive home, but she began abusing drugs and alcohol at a young age, and things only spiraled downward from there. She complied with Gerald's sick desires when he began abducting girls to fulfill his sexual fantasies. The couple scoped out their victims at local shopping malls, where Charlene lured them to Gerald's van. In one of their most prolific murders, the pair forced a young couple named Craig Miller and Mary Elizabeth Showers into their car. They shot Miller dead and brought Showers back to their home, where they sexually abused her before taking her to a field and executing her. A friend of one of the victims took note of Gerald and Charlene's license plate numbers and reported them, leading to their arrest. Charlene claimed Gerald was solely responsible for the heinous crimes, but many believed that he never killed her because she complied, and that she was just as guilty as he was. Gerald died from cancer while awaiting his execution. Charlene spent 17 years behind bars and was released in 1997, thereafter changing her name and assuming a new identity to try and escape her dark past. When the media caught up to her, she maintained her claim that she, too, was a victim. Number 7. The Ken and Barbie Killers. Paul Bernardo was an attractive and charming Scarborough, Ontario native. who used his skills and looks to manipulate women. Unbeknownst to the local population at the time, he embarked on a series of violent crimes against women starting in 1987. He brutalized his victims for 5 years, and although Bernardo was questioned twice, he was never officially considered a suspect. The same year he started attacking women, he met Karla Homolka, an attractive blonde from a good family with a seemingly promising future. Their attraction was instant and magnetic, and as it turned out, Homolka had the same dark, twisted fantasies as her new lover. Homolka knew her boyfriend was sexually abusing women and was perfectly fine with it, and the couple eventually became engaged. But by then, Bernardo was getting bored. When he expressed a desire to victimize Homolka's 15-year-old sister Tammy, his fiancée dutifully went along with the sick plan, agreeing to secure her younger sister's virginity for him as a Christmas gift. During a family Christmas party, Homolka spiked Tammy's drinks with veterinary drugs, rendering her unconscious. Later that night, she and Bernardo videotaped themselves taking turns raping Tammy. The teen began choking on her own vomit, prompting the deranged couple to hide evidence and call 911. Tammy was pronounced dead at the hospital, and her death was ruled accidental due to alcohol poisoning despite a chemical burn on her face. Bernardo and Homolka continued their gruesome crimes, and they got married in the meantime. Police eventually traced multiple murders to the pair. After scrambling for a plea deal, Homolka served prison time and was released in 2005. Bernardo, on the other hand, was sentenced to life. He is eligible for parole, but has not received it as of yet. Hey, real quick, if you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're liking this video, then please be sure to hit that thumbs up button and the subscribe button too if you haven't already. Number 6. The Lonely Hearts Killers. In 1947, single mother and Florida native Martha Beck met Raymond Fernandez through a singles ad she'd placed. The pair quickly became engaged, and soon enough, Beck abandoned her 2 children and appeared on her lover's New York City doorstep. Fernandez perceived Beck's willingness to leave her children as a sign of her devotion to him. She soon began aiding him in a series of sick crimes, murdering at least 3 people in 1949 alone, including a toddler. Dubbed the Lonely Hearts Killers, the pair used singles ads to lure and kill lonely women, with Beck sometimes posing as Fernandez's sister to make the situation seem safe. Armed with a violent and jealous temper, Beck tried to stop Fernandez from going all the way with his victims. When it happened, she unleashed her fury on both parties. At one point, Beck caught Fernandez in bed with a woman named Janet Faye and bludgeoned her with a hammer. Fernandez then brutally strangled the 66-year-old. During their criminal free-for-all, the couple met and stayed with 28-year-old single mother Delphine Downing near Grand Rapids, Michigan. Fernandez drugged Downing, who fell into an obvious state of stupor, causing her toddler to become alarmed. Set off by the child's crying, Beck drowned the little one, and Fernandez shot Downing to death. They buried the bodies in the basement. Concerned neighbors summoned police to the household, and the pair was arrested. Fernandez confessed, but later retracted his confession. Law enforcement connected the pair to 17 murders altogether, but they were only ever tried for Janet Faye's murder, for which they were convicted and sentenced to death. Beck and Fernandez were executed on March 8th of 1951. Number 5. Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate met when he was 18 and she was just 13. Starkweather committed his first murder the following year in 1957. When a gas station clerk refused to sell him a stuffed toy for Caril that he couldn't afford. His life derailed from there when he lost his job and couldn't pay his rent. While the exact details are murky, Starkweather went to Fugate's house one night and killed her mother, stepfather, and baby sister. The couple continued to live in the house for several days among the decomposing bodies, with a sign on the front door saying they had the flu to deter visitors from prying. By the time Fugate's grandmother became suspicious and called the police, the pair had fled to a Nebraska farm and killed the owner. They then murdered a teenage couple they had hitched a ride with and continued their killing spree from there. The couple's disturbing activities led to a full-scale manhunt and an eventual surrender to police. At first, Fugate was framed as just another of Starkweather's victims, but it eventually became clear she was a willing accomplice. Starkweather was sentenced to death and was executed the following year. Fugate received a life sentence because she could have left her lover several times and chose not to, which was perceived as a reflection of her guilt. She was released for good behavior in 1976 after serving 17 years, but was denied a pardon. Number 4. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Between July 1963 and October of 1965, a British couple named Ian Brady and Myra Hindley committed a series of killings known as the MOURNERS. Their victims were all very young, and at least 4 of them were sexually assaulted. The pair met in 1961 through work, where Hindley became enamored with Brady, who already had an extensive criminal record containing dozens of burglary and assault charges. The couple developed a sick obsession with reading Nazi propaganda and entertaining fantasies of Aryan perfection, prompting Hindley to bleach her hair and change her wardrobe. They also enjoyed renting books about crime and torture from the library and reportedly planned robberies together, which never came to fruition. Hindley would later recall that Brady began fantasizing about committing the perfect murder in 1963. The couple killed their first victim, 16-year-old Pauline Reedy, in July of that year. They sexually abused and beat her and then buried her in a shallow grave, before moving on to their next target and killing him in a similar fashion. The couple also rented a van and robbed a few banks. Brady's brother-in-law, David Smith, reported the pair to police after witnessing the murder of a 17-year-old firsthand. Officers initially only arrested Brady on suspicion of murder, but soon charged Hindley as well. Both received life sentences and expressed remorse, with Hindley largely blaming Brady for the crimes. She died of pneumonia in 2002 at the age of 60, and Brady was locked in a mental institution until his death in 2017. Number 3. Ray and Faye Copland. Ray Copland met and married Faye Wilson in 1940 after serving a prison sentence for fraud. His record made it difficult for the farmer to purchase cattle, so he began taking in drifters and employing them as farmhands at his Mooresville, Missouri property. He had them buy cattle using phony checks. After being released, Copland resumed his criminal activities and was repeatedly thrown into jail throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. He and his wife eventually became partners in crime, setting up vagabonds to buy cattle with forged checks, and then shooting them after the transactions were over. This went on for decades, with the couple committing at least 5 murders before they were finally caught in 1989, when one of their employees saw human bones on their property. Faye claimed that Ray had abused her for the better part of 50 years in hopes of copping a plea deal, but her efforts failed. The pair became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in 1993 at the ages of 69 and 76. Ray died on death row of natural causes that year. Faye's sentence was commuted to life, and she passed away in 2002 from a stroke, just months after being paroled into hospice care. Number 2. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. Alton Coleman was a middle school dropout born in 1955 to a mother who worked 3 jobs in Waukegan, Illinois. She was no stranger to the law, having been charged with sex crimes 6 times between 1973 and 1983 alone, and never held a steady job. In 1984, Coleman went on a months-long crime spree throughout the American Midwest with his girlfriend, Deborah Brown. Altogether, the couple committed 8 murders, 7 sexual assaults, 3 kidnappings, and 14 armed robberies. Their first known murder victim was a 9-year-old girl from Kenosha, Wisconsin, named Vernita Wheat. The pair then proceeded to Gary, Indiana, where they abducted 2 girls aged 7 and 9. One managed to escape, but the other was choked to death. Soon enough, the FBI was all over Coleman and Brown, even creating an 11th spot on its 10 most wanted list to draw attention to the couple. But they managed to evade authorities for 53 days while continuing along their path of destruction. Finally, a childhood friend recognized Coleman, and the police apprehended the pair at an Illinois park. They were both sentenced to death, and Coleman was executed in Ohio in 2002. Brown's sentence was commuted to life due to her low IQ, despite initially showing no remorse for her crimes, and nobody ever determined their motive for committing these disturbing acts. Number 1. David and Catherine Birnie. Catherine Harrison left her husband and 6 children to be with David Birnie, whom she had met years earlier when she was just 12 years old. The two eventually married, and in 1986 they embarked on a murderous crime spree, killing all but one of their 5 known victims. They drove around the city of Perth in Western Australia, searching for women who were alone. Catherine lured the unsuspecting victim into the vehicle, who was then taken to the couple's home and tortured. Chained to the bed, the unfortunate target would be sexually abused and killed by David, while Catherine cheered her husband on. The law finally caught up with the couple when their final victim, 17-year-old Kate Moore, escaped after the Birnies abducted her at knife point. While Catherine tended to a drug deal at the front door, having forgotten to chain her victim to the bed, Kate broke the lock on a window and climbed out. She then ran to a nearby vacuum cleaner store, where the shop owner called the police. The couple was arrested and David confessed, revealing the location of 4 graves in their yard. They both received 4 life sentences. David committed suicide in prison in 2005. Birnie remains in prison, But some, including her youngest son, who claims he was assaulted because of who his mother is, don't think the sentence is harsh enough and have called for her execution. Adlison de Oliveira vanished while working beside a river near his home. It's every family's nightmare to hear about a family member simply going missing, and the entire town where he lived was alarmed. Adlison was a Brazilian farmer in the center of his country. The day after he vanished, local villagers hunted down and slaughtered a giant alligator that they believed was responsible for his disappearance, seeing as they had found Adlison's flip-flops and a cigarette lighter near the water. And as it turned out, the alligator absolutely was responsible. This 13-foot reptile had bones, skin, flesh, and hair found inside of its stomach. The beast probably grabbed hold of Adlison as he labored too close to the murky water, then dragged him into the river and ate him. Alligators are feared throughout the region, and they're notorious for dragging their victims, often late-night fishermen, into rivers and lakes. Plus, these are some of the biggest and fiercest alligators in the world. Number 9. The Banker and the Shark. A banker working with Xanthos Investment was out fishing when he accidentally caught a shark. The shark was an impressive enough discovery, but it got even more incredible when the shark literally burped out a foot. Humphrey Simmons couldn't believe his eyes. He'd been out fishing with a group of his friends when the tiger shark bit his line. Simmons pulled the shark to the surface, his friend leaned in with a gun and shot the shark several times in the head, and that was when the enormous fish regurgitated a human foot, complete from the knee down. At the same time that the shark puked up the foot, everyone on board smelt a horrible stink coming from the shark. They knew right away that they needed to open up the shark's belly and see what was inside. And, well, the shark had an entire body in its belly. The body was missing its head and foot, and according to Business Insider, was later identified as the body of a missing sailor. What would you do if you saw a shark cough up a human foot? The whole thing seems pretty terrifying to me. Would you call the police immediately or just dump the whole thing back in the water and be done with it? Number 8. Lady and the Bear. The human remains of a woman were recently found inside the belly of a black bear in Colorado. The bear was accused of killing a 39-year-old woman in an extremely rare attack. But not only were the woman's leftovers found in the 204-pound female bear, but also in 2 of her young cubs, according to Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Corey Chick, CPW manager of the Southwest region, said that they could not determine how the attack took place or how exactly her remains got inside of the bear's bellies. She was also not named for privacy reasons. Unfortunately, the bear had to be euthanized. Once a bear gets a taste for human flesh, no matter how young it is, authorities almost always euthanize them, claiming that once a bear eats a human, it's at risk of committing future human murders. Do you agree with their policy of killing bears that eat people? Or could the bears be kept in captivity? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. But also remember to subscribe to World List if you haven't already. Number 7. Body in a python. In Indonesia, a man's body was found inside of a massive python. Akbar Salubiro went missing on the island of Sulawesi after heading out to harvest some palm oil. The man was only 25 years old. Police told the BBC that following a search for the missing young man, they discovered an enormous snake with a rather suspicious bulge in its stomach. It was a reticulated python, estimated to be over 23 feet in length. Fearing the worst, the authorities cut the snake open, and yes, the body of the missing man was found inside. But it was too late. He'd already suffocated to death inside of the snake. And this is no surprise, seeing as reticulated pythons are some of the largest reptiles in the world. They suffocate their victims before opening their jaws and swallowing them whole. Attacks on humans are very rare, but they seem to happen most often in Indonesia. Pythons usually prefer to attack young children or animals. But if they see a person alone and vulnerable, and if they're large enough, they will sometimes strike. If you don't see a strike coming, you end up in the snake's belly. Steer clear of these vicious serpents. Number 6. Mountain Lion Mania. The Arizona Game and Fish Department was recently forced to euthanize 3 mountain lions after they were caught munching on human remains they found on a hiking trail. The lions probably didn't kill the victim, or so says the department, but they definitely found parts of the corpse and had a feast. This is very unusual behavior, as mountain lions aren't normally scavengers and don't normally eat the meat of humans. But because they had tasted human meat, the authorities weren't left with a lot of options. This is because the cats were very close to a popular hiking trail, very near to homes, and very capable of ambushing small children or lonely people, especially since they'd already tasted human blood. The remains were found by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The police worked with the medical examiner's office to determine the cause of death, though nothing has been officially released yet. They are, however, saying that the mountain lions eating the body definitely contaminated any potential evidence in what could be a complicated investigation. The cats were just trying to survive, but they ruined a potential crime scene. Do you think that the person was murdered and fed to the lions intentionally, or did the lions attack a living human and take him down together? Number 5. Man in the Whale. James Bartley was swallowed by a sperm whale in the year 1891. It was during a whaling expedition near the Falkland Islands, one of the most remote places in the world off the coast of Argentina. James had his boat attacked by no less than a fully grown whale. During the struggle between James and the whale, he somehow ended up inside of its mouth and got swallowed whole directly into its stomach. James spent 36 hours inside of the whale before some other sailors caught the beast and then carved him out. When they finally got James outside into fresh air, his skin had been bleached beyond repair by the gastric juices in the whale's stomach. He was also blind for the rest of his life. James Bartley was probably the only man who ever survived being swallowed by a whale. He lived for another 18 years after the incident. However, it's important to note that the story gained a significant amount of publicity near the end of the 19th century, and some people have questioned the legitimacy of the story. That's right, they're calling the whole thing a total hoax. But could it have been real? The truth is that it is indeed physically possible for a sperm whale to swallow a person whole. Sperm whales are known for swallowing giant squids. The only issue here is that a human would likely be crushed and/or suffocated by the time they reached the whale's 4-chambered stomach. It would theoretically be possible, but the whale's stomach would have to not work the way it was supposed to. It seems more likely that a bunch of old sailors came up with a tall tale and it got published in a bunch of magazines and newspapers. After all, if you thought people were gullible about false news today, well, it was even worse back over 100 years ago. Number 4. Limbs in a crocodile. A leg and an arm, each belonging to the same man, were found inside the stomach of a monster crocodile in Indonesia. The crocodile was undoubtedly guilty of mauling a man to his death in Borneo. Authorities were called in to deal with the rampaging reptile, which they shot to death close to a riverbank where a worker from a palm oil plantation had gone missing 2 days prior. Only his sandals and motorbike were found at the site. The man's body wasn't found until much later. His body was pulled out of the water and, of course, it was missing 2 limbs. The police spotted the crocodile swimming nearby and decided to kill it. Inside that croc's stomach, police found the man's missing limbs. His wife was devastated by the tragic news. She said that her husband had left home to gather clams for them to eat, that she had never imagined he would end up inside the belly of a crocodile, and really, who can blame her? Nobody expects to be eaten by a 20-foot-long carnivorous monster lizard while just trying to pick up dinner. But believe it or not, this is actually pretty common in Indonesia. Just in 2016, a tourist from Russia was killed and chomped on by a crocodile while at a popular diving site in the Raja Ampat Islands. Indonesia is simply not a place you want to mess around with wildlife. It's more dangerous than you might think. Number 3. Missing in the lion cage. At a safari park in Pakistan, the skeleton of a young man was recently found inside the lion enclosure. The skull and bones of 18-year-old Muhammad Bilal, who was reported missing the day before, were found in a cage that housed 4 lions at Lahore Safari Park. According to the Daily Mail, the young man had simply gone out to gather fodder for the cattle when he ended up missing. At the safari park, workers also discovered scraps of his clothing. Police are now saying that the young man snuck into the safari park, climbed into the lion enclosure, and tried to find cattle fodder to bring back home. But let me tell you, the last place you want to steal food from is a lion's enclosure. Park officials never actually opened the stomach of the lions to check for the young boy's remains. It seemed pretty obvious the big cats ate him, though. There was even security footage of him scaling the fence. And even though the locals were outraged, the Pakistan Wildlife Foundation basically said the locals had a responsibility to not deliberately climb into animal enclosures. So what do you think? If you're stupid enough to climb into the lion's den, you should expect to be eaten whole, right? Or if you disagree, please let me know why. Number 2. Nazi in a catfish. There's been a rumor going around recently that the remains of a Nazi soldier were found inside the belly of a giant catfish. The rumor comes thanks to some strange photos that have been circulating around the internet, showing bones and Nazi paraphernalia allegedly found inside a catfish. The original story said that a pair of Polish fishermen found the catfish, which weighed over 410 pounds, and then they opened it up to find shards of human bone and military artifacts dating back to Germany in the Second World War. Unfortunately, this story was discovered to be, like many tall tales, a fabrication reported by a fake news outlet online. The pictures are in no way related, at least the way they're told in the story. And besides, considering the average lifespan of a catfish is only about 20 years, and seeing how they primarily eat algae and insects, there's really no way a catfish did this. However, it's possible that a Greenland shark, which does live for up to 250 years, could have eaten a Nazi soldier nearly 80 years ago and might still be swimming around in the water today. If you want to look for remnants of World War II inside of animals, it would probably be best to start with them. Number 1. The Neanderthal boy in a bird. Researchers were recently stunned when they discovered the bones of a giant bird from the Ice Age. But it wasn't the bird itself that freaked the scientists out. Instead, it was the fact that the skeletal remains of a Neanderthal child were found within the bird. Analysis showed that there were dozens of holes in the child's bones, suggesting the child had passed through the animal's digestive system. The child was between 5 and 7 years old when it was eaten. Scientists believe the bird didn't just feed on the child after it had already died. It was much scarier than that. No, it didn't scavenge the kid's remains. Investigators are fairly certain that the bird attacked and ate the child on purpose. The bones were found deep inside of a cave in Poland. And they go back around 50,000 years to a time when some birds were far larger than people, and a lot like winged dinosaurs. This new discovery just goes to prove that back before modern times, us humans, we were a lot closer to the bottom of the food chain. Imagine losing your child because of a 10-foot bird who came into your backyard and then ate them. So which of these animals do you think would eat you before you could eat them? Are there any of these creatures that you think you could encounter, fight, and then win? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, please be sure to hit that subscribe button before you leave. We'll see you next time.